What is going on, my fellow makers? Matt from Keep Making. Today I'm going to show you how I made D&D Wargaming Terrain float. Let's get to it.
Shall we begin?
So if you've been following what I'm doing on the channel recently, you see that I made this Ilario proxy to fit in with my fungal Sylvaneth warband. So like these mushroom sort of myconid people, and this is their leader. And here's what the rest of the warband looks like. And you'll notice they all have the same type of basing. That's very intentional, these white rocks with all the fungus overgrown. And so now I'm embarking on making a terrain set to match. So start off going back to Lost Kingdom Miniatures, who also made the models with this tree. You see a lot of the models for the bases have this similar aesthetic, and so I'll be using a lot of these and printing them off on my resin printer. But then I also head over to Thingiverse and get some free files, and all the links of these files will be listed in the description below. These are from Lost Adventures. This was a fungal grotto file I found, which was perfect. So definitely support these artists and all their creations too. This Moral Tree will be making a comeback as well. So I just started loading all this stuff into the slicer and getting at it. Once all the resin models are done printing, it's time to clean them up. So if you saw the video on my fungal warband, you'll know I like to do test models, and this is the test model for this terrain set. Just needed a proof of concept to see if it worked, and what I went with here with all the casting plaster and modeling clay, it was a little bit too heavy to be supported by the waterfall itself, so that was good to know before I started moving forward. As I move forward, I'm cleaning up all these 3D printed parts. So these are off my FDM printer, and this is PLA plastic, so heat, just get all the extra stringy stuff off, and then we'll move over to the basing. To base them, I just use a hardboard, cardboard. This is cardstock, but I do end up going over to like a hardboard that I get off the back of an old IKEA frame later on, and I'm just trimming off the edges here, and then I'll come around and bevel them so that they fit better into the terrain mats I use. And with some hot glue, I'm just adhering the 3D printed parts onto the base. And I hang on to those corner pieces I cut off because I'll be using them to build up a little bit of a pool. Once I've built up that first layer, I'm using some cork bits to kind of give it some texture and blend in more to the scenery. And I use that same process to do the rest of the pieces as well. Now when you're beveling edges like this, it's important to have a fresh blade, or a very sharp one at least. That way you're not going to get any janky cuts or hurt yourself. Now most of the floating will be hidden by the waterfalls, but for this tree I don't have that option, so I'm using some of these gachapon figure stands from Hobby Link Japan. Basically all I'm using from it is this clear acrylic rod. I'm going to drill a hole in the bottom of this tree piece and then just insert that rod in there and it'll be floating.
Most of these tents are shops. These are
But before I go any further with any of the resin pieces, I give them all a clean up so that there's no support marks or any sort of weird areas that'll pick up paint. And this is how everything is looking so far. The next step we're going to do is actually give these a prime. That way we'll have no warpage in the basing material, the cardstock or the hardboard. And to prime them, I'm using this 2-in-1 filler primer that's also sandable. This will give us a nice coating over them. That way I won't have any warpage or water damage. Now the moisture I'm protecting it from is going to come in the form of this ground texture. I usually use the AK ground textures, but because this is such a big project, that would get pretty expensive. So I mixed some tile grout and some stones I got from the dollar store with a whole ton of glue and a little bit of water, and that'll give us a ground paste kind of thing. When it's all mixed up, we got our icky ice cap going here, and we're going to apply that all over our bases with a really old or a cheap brush. Now while I'm waiting for that ground texture to dry, I'm going to move on to making the floating island. So to do this, I'm going to use XPS foam, and I'm going to layer it so that you get a longer, sort of taller piece. So to do this, I sketch out what I want the playable surface of it to be, and then I'm just going to layer pieces underneath that, glue them together, and then I'm going to cut them all out using a hot wire tool and a X-Acto knife. Once they're all glued together, I'm just sculpting sort of a rock formation, jagged edges to give it more of a natural look. Now when I've cut them into basic rock shapes, I need to add a little bit of texture. So I just roll up some tinfoil, and I just roll this tinfoil ball all over these pieces, indenting into it to give it more of an interesting texture that'll pick up more paint in the wash and gives it a more natural look. Now, even when you prepare for things to go wrong, sometimes they still do. So here was the piece of cardstock I used, which is thinner than all of the rest of them, which I'm glad I used the hardboard. So because this warped, I'm just gluing it onto a thicker piece of hardboard, and I'll use more ground texture to blend those two pieces in. To seal the floating rocks, I'm going to use some Mod Podge mixed with some black paint to give them an all-over coat. That way I know the foam is sealed and can be spray painted. So to paint all the pieces, I'm using that same primer again, and for the rocks, this off-white. Then I'm going to hit everything with a pure white from above to give it a zenithal highlight. And they come out looking like this. Now, I wasn't loving the way that the rocks turned out. You can see the gaps between where I glued XPS pieces together, and so I actually used this in a way to test some other things I wanted to try. So first I'll dig a hole in here and we'll do a smaller waterfall that's coming out of the middle of the rock opposed to the top, and we're also going to add some texture in between those layers to give it more of a natural look but also hide those gaps. Once those gaps have been sealed and dried, we can move on into the painting process. So before we move on to that, I just want to tell you guys a little bit about what's going on here at Keep Making. I've recently started a Patreon page. So I have 3 tiers going. I have the Apprentice, the Journeyman, and the Master Maker. With the Apprentice, you're going to get access to the polls where I ask you what you want to see me tackle next, or color schemes, stuff like that, and all of the community posts and work in progress shots you'll be able to see. With the Journeyman, you get all that and more includes a weekly video where I review a hobby product or a tool that you didn't know could be used for hobby work, and anything like that. And then with the Master Maker tier, you actually get to add suggestions into that poll, so you can poll with polls. So check out my Patreon, guys. If you feel so inclined to help me keep making, I would really appreciate it. It just helps me cover the cost of all this building supplies and stuff, and I do have a full-time job, so at this current rate I'm only able to get a video probably once a month out, but hopefully, if this channel continues to grow the way it has been, then hopefully with the Patreon going up, we can get some, a little bit of help paying for some of these hobby stuff and all this product. So thank you so much, guys, and if you feel inclined to support me on Patreon, the link will be in the description. Now let's get back to the build. Now for the 3D printed rocks, we're going to use the same formula I did on all of the fungal Sylvaneth tribe, and that is just metal medium mixed with an ivory paint. It gives it a little bit of a shimmer, it gives it a little bit more visual interest, and I just hit all the rocks on all the pieces the same way. But because Model Cheap isn't paint, I skipped that step with the floating rocks and I just used an ivory with no metal medium mixed in. Could have done this by hand, but to speed things up, I go through the airbrush mixing a burnt umber and a black ink so that I can get overall coverage and really make use of that zenithal highlight. Mixing these cheap light green and light brown acrylics, I'm going to mix them up together and go over all of the fallen trees or tree trunks on the base. Now, here's where I forgot that these are supposed to be covered in mushrooms, so I go through and snip all these mushrooms off of the printing bars they come on, and I just super glue them onto the bases, and then I'll use a hand primer to prime them. Then all the mushrooms, regardless of size, get this light tan base coat. While I was base coating, I pick out some of the more detailed pieces on some of the more detailed models, and then I move on to doing a lighter tan, almost an off-white dry brush in all of the mushrooms. Then I move on to using the same technique with the light tan on all of the wood and fallen trees. Now before I move any further, I actually want to start tackling the waterfalls because I want to be able to paint everything at once, and right now I can't paint the floating rocks because they're upside down. So to do this, I use some acrylic. I just score it with a knife, clamp it down, and snap it off. There's probably much better and safer ways to do this. I recommend using gloves if you do. I did manage to snag myself a couple times, and I don't recommend it. Then to bend the acrylic into shape, because it's very brittle, I score it with this hobby saw, and then I'm using my heat gun to actually bend it and melt it into shape. Then I adhere the bottom piece of the acrylic into the areas I know I'm going to fill up with epoxy later. And then I go about adhering the other side into the floating islands, whether they're coming out or attached to the tops. So to make the ground formations on top of these floating islands, I do the same thing I did on the bases of the Sylvaneth warband. That is using cork, and then I'm going to chip it off into shape to give a little bit more interesting texture. Then I can start putting some of those printed pieces on top and giving this area more detail. To do some of the bigger pieces, I actually make a hole and super glue them in, and for some of the others, hot glue is just enough. To give a little more playable variation to some of these top pieces, I'm going to add a little bit more cork and give it some elevation. For this one piece, because it was a failed print the first time I tried to print the tree, I'm actually just going to use some hot glue and kind of sculpt some roots to this mushroom. Then I continue on doing the same thing for the other pieces, but the pieces where the waterfall is coming from the top, I leave that piece out so that I'll have a little bit of a bed to pour the epoxy into. Then moving on to the texturing the tops, that's where I bust out the AK ground textures, and I'm using muddy ground on the tops on all the cork pieces the same way I did for the warband and the L'Oreal. And then in all the beds where the epoxy is going to pour, I'm using this light earth to bring out the epoxy color later on with a white base, but also give sort of like that sandy texture. For the second time, I forgot there's supposed to be a lot of mushrooms on these pieces, so again I go in with some super glue and activator and just put some on the top pieces as well. And again, I'm busting out the brush out primer to prime all the mushrooms, as well as all of the pieces I added on top. And then the last thing before the wash is to do a cork brown on all of these bonsai trees. So now I go in and do an oil wash. I used acrylic washes on all the pieces before, but this is pretty much the same color I was getting from there, and I just like the way that the oil wash flows better on terrain pieces, so that's why I chose to do that. Also, it's important to note that I did clear coat these before I went out. The thinner in the oil washes, if you're making it, can sort of chip away at your paint and peel it off if you don't seal it beforehand, so it's important to do so. And then the larger mushrooms get this sort of yellowy brown wash. I let that wash dry overnight, and now I'm going in with just a variety of speed paint colors to do all the mushroom tops. I like using speed paints for this because they pick up all the details in the mushrooms and all their different variations and textures, and I just think it's really cool the way they pop. Then moving on to the bonsai tree canopies, I paint them all in the same dark green color. Then I paint all the flowers, their stems in a bright green and then their petals in a bright pink. Now somehow I managed to lose the footage, but before I move on to the other steps, I do give the rocks all a white dry brush with a bright white color, and you can see that here. Then before moving on to the flocking, I just go over that muddy ground texture in the dry brush with this sort of khaki, dark green, sort of grayish color. Then moving on to the vegetation, I'm going to use all of these grass tufts, the same ones I used on all of the fungal troop up until this point, which is this sort of arid one from Games Workshop, and then this dark green from Shadows Edge Miniatures. If you saw my last videos, I'm using the same type of flocking mixture. So putting some glue down, I mix up some Woodland Scenics, just pure green color, green grass color, and then I mix in some like tea leaves and some like lichen, blend it all up, mix it together, and that's what's going on the base for the flocking. I always like to keep some sort of paper underneath while I'm doing this, that way I can gather up all the excess and I'm making less waste. And to seal all that flocking, I'm going to use some IPA through a pipette. Sorry, it's a little bit off screen here, and I'm soaking all of that flocking, and then I'm going to come through with some watered down Mod Podge, use it through a pipette as well, and that'll get a seal through all of these. And once everything's sealed in with that Mod Podge, I can move on to pouring the epoxy. I don't use epoxy resin, that usually takes 8 hours. What I do is I mix a plumber's epoxy, which is $2.50 from the dollar store, with some IPA, so isopropyl alcohol, and some transparent blue paint. It's a lot cheaper, it dries a lot faster, and the leaks will hurt you less because they'll be dry in 5 minutes, and it's a little bit less viscous. So I just start pouring it in, and because I added the IPA, I get a little bit more flow. Your results may vary. You have to experiment what amount of IPA is going to work for you at what concentration. I'm using 70% and I use 1 milliliter, and that seemed to work for me per epoxy mix. To add some texture to the water after it's cured, I'm just using this heavy gloss gel, and I'm putting a lot of it at the areas where the waterfall meets the water. Okay, Matt from the future here. I realize that I've lost the footage of me actually making the waterfall texture. So what I'll do is I'll show you right now. So you saw me earlier cutting these acrylic pieces into shape. All I do is use the same gloss heavy gel that I used on the texturing of where the waterfall meets the water. And I'm just coming in like this. If the water's going down this way towards myself here, you want to pull those wave textures down. So I'm just going in with this, pulling it down, and you want to make sure that you're covering all of the acrylic like so. Down, it's going to create those wave textures like water falling over itself. That's what we want. What we do want to avoid, and that's why you got to get a thick glob, is we want to avoid brush strokes, because that texture will show up and be noticeable, and we don't want that. So it's important to glob it on here. It takes longer to dry this way, obviously, but we glob it on. Just keep pulling it towards myself here in this direction where we want the water to go. We want to have no blank spaces, just so that, you know, you're not realizing that it is just a sheet of acrylic. So once you do this front side, you'll want to do the back as well, and the sides are important too, to really hide that texture of the acrylic, especially if you cut it janky the way I did. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Just pulling that texture down. Don't want it to build up too much. That way it won't take so long to dry and you won't get any discoloration. The thinner you can get it, the better, but you do want it thick to really sell the texture. So just finding a balance between the thin areas and the thick ones, just like so. Now at this point I wasn't really loving the floating islands. I thought they were a little bit barren, and that transition between the top layer and the rock itself was a little too pronounced. So I busted out some solder. You could also use some armature wire or clay or whatever. This is what I had available to me, and I think it worked really well because it's super flexible and super lightweight. So all I do is cut a 45-degree angle on one end and poke it into the rock itself. Let me know where it's going to hang, what it's going to look like, and I just add some various sizes to see what kind of effect I can get, how good I can make these vines look. And then once I figure that's kind of what I'm going for, I'm just going to hot glue it all over to give it a little bit more texture and so I can actually paint it. Then I spray it down with some water so it'll, you know, cool down very fast, and I start twisting it to give it more of a vine texture. After that, I just take the bare end and glue the edge of it and poke it back into the hole I made earlier. Now I want to add a little bit of a seal onto these hot glued pieces, so I'm coming in with some matte Mod Podge again. I wish I would have added paint to this, maybe a dark brown or dark green to give it more of that vine look, but anyways, I come in with some matte Mod Podge. That'll give me a seal on all of these hot glued pieces and make it easier for things to adhere onto them. And the thing we're adhering is just some of the flocking that I used earlier, mixed with some more Mod Podge and a little bit of water, so we get our unholy guacamole. Now this part can get a little messy, so I use a glove and I'm just placing it into those vines, giving a little bit of texture. And then I continue on with the unholy guacamole. I'm going over all of the pieces to give that vine overgrowth I'm looking for, and I'll blend the seam between the top part of the floating island and the rock itself. Then I add quite a bit more water to that same mixture, and I'm going over all of the rocks to give kind of more of a mossy feel than a vine one that'll run down the rocks and give a sort of worn, weathered look. My soul left to. And then finally, I add a little bit of detail to some of the mushrooms to give them that sort of magical Feywild feel. Okay, So that'll do it for the actual work in this progress. I have like 5 minutes of glamour shots to show you guys, which I'm actually really proud of. So before all that, just want to let you know where you can find me online. Obviously here on YouTube at Keep Making. You can find me on Instagram, Keep_Making, and you can find me on TikTok, Keep_Making. I'd love to hear from people on those apps and stuff, so give me a follow down below. Make sure you're liking in this video and subscribing to the channel. Hit that bell if you feel so inclined. And don't forget, you can subscribe to my Patreon at any of the 3 levels that goes, with my undying gratitude. Without any further ado, let's get into those glamour shots.
Shall we begin?